Hey guys, Ex-Peon here, and today we are returning to the OD&D Iceberg video. So, starting off Tier 5, Fireball. You might not know this, but Fireball used to be written as two separate words. This seems to have changed into the single word Fireball we know and love in the Greyhawk supplement. All magical weaponry is usable by fighters. OD&D describes weapon availability in a curious way. Rather than just say that fighting men can use any weapon, they describe their weapon access by saying they can use any magical weapon. This is repeated for clerics, saying that they can use magical armor and non-edged magical weapons. For magic users, it just says they can use daggers. One could attempt to read more into this, but I think it was really just poor writing. It does convey the fact, though, that fighters using all magical weapons is a huge advantage. Magical swords appear far more often in randomly generated loot than other magical weapons, and they are also intelligent and grant unique powers no other magical weapon can. Intelligent swords. One of the most fascinating elements of OD&D is magic swords. Magic swords are intelligent, having their own alignments, an intelligence score, and an egoism rating. They actually damage people with the wrong alignment who try to pick them up. If the sword is much more intelligent than the wielder, it will take control of them. The more intelligent a sword is, the greater its communicative abilities, which range from nil to empathic to speech to telepathic. Swords can grant powers around detection or even things like teleportation, X-ray vision, or flying. This is why fighters being able to use magic swords is such a big deal. It opens them up to incredible magic powers that otherwise would be in the sole purview of magic users. Biblical spells. The original iteration of D&D was perhaps less subtle about its Christian influences, with its cross-wielding clerics having mostly Catholic level titles, and this extends to the spell list as well. Perhaps the most obvious on the nose spell is Sticks to Snakes, which does exactly what it sounds like by letting you be Moses. I've linked a blog article about this topic in the description, which goes into much greater details on the spells inspired by the Bible. Do check it out. Clerics can't use edged weapons. An oft-mocked element of OD&D is that clerics can't use edged weapons. OD&D never explains why, and I suspect it was entirely a balance issue to give fighters an edge over clerics. It's been justified by players and Gary Gygax himself, I believe, with dubious historiography around medieval figures like Bishop Turpin, who allegedly went into battle with blunt weapons so as not to shed blood. I'll link an article on the matter in the description. Personally, I see this as a post hoc, pseudo historical justification for a game balance decision. 30 to 300 wandering orcs. Something that might seem disconcerting for modern players is to see that in the wilderness you encounter orcs in numbers ranging from 30 to 300. Even 30 orcs seems like an overwhelming amount for high level parties, let alone low level parties. My understanding is that D&D was played at this point much more like a war game, so players would likely be leading troops through the woods. Plus, if you use the chainmail rules for combat, then high enough level player characters can dish out a number of attacks far more appropriate for the number of monsters appearing. Thools. Thools are an example of D&D lore being made from a typo. Thools are listed in a wandering monster table between gnolls and ghouls. They don't appear anywhere else. While it's just a silly typo, it was later retconned into being a hybrid of a hobgoblin, troll, and ghoul. I don't even want to think about how that happened. Charm Person slash Sleep Don't End. A terrifying fact about the spells Charm Person and Sleep, both first level spells, is that they have no listed duration in meta magic, other than the statement that dispel magic can remove a charm. Depending on how you interpret that, Charm Person could make someone a lifelong slave, and Sleep could put someone in a coma. Greyhawk softened Charm Person by giving the Charm Person a regular interval where they can attempt to break this charm, but it still remained very potent and very creepy. Control Weather. Interestingly, the final spell in the original version of the game is the 6th level spell Control Weather. It being last isn't necessarily an indication that it was considered the most powerful, though it does seem admittedly humble next to Anti-Magic's Shell or Disintegrate. I do think it demonstrates what a large jump Greyhawk made in endgame power levels, as the game goes from 6th level spells to 9th level spells and adds insane spells like Wish. Jousting. OD&D actually has rules for jousting, technically. It's buried in the back of chainmail, and I've heard it described as basically rock, paper, scissors. Personally, it went over my head when I glanced at it. Funnily enough, Volume 3 of OD&D says that fighting men in castles will demand any passing fighting men duel them in a joust. If the visitor loses, he has to give his armor to the other man. If he wins, the castle has to host them for a month, give them 2 weeks' rations, and give them war horses if necessary. Subduing dragons. OD&D actually does have rules for non-lethal combat, but it's specifically for, quote, subduing dragons. Presumably, it works fine for other monsters. The system is interesting as you deal subdual damage, not real damage. In each round, you roll percentile dice trying to roll equal to or under the percentage of hit points it's lost so far. It gives an example of a dragon with 66 hit points that takes 11 damage in one round. For it to be subdued, they would have to roll 17% or lower. I've never used it or heard an account of anyone else using it, so I don't know how smooth it is, but it is an interesting system. Llama. OD&D has some very evocative level titles such as Hero, Swashbuckler, and Necromancer, but incredibly out of place one is Lama for 7th level clerics. This doesn't fit because Lama is the term for spiritual leaders of Tibetan Buddhism, while the other level titles like Curate and Bishop are decidedly Christian. The final level title is Patriarch rather than Pope, so perhaps the authors were going for a multicultural flavor for their clerics rather than just strictly sticking with medieval Catholic priests. Gary confused vicars and curates. Gary listed curates as being above vicars in cleric level titles, but he actually got that backwards. Shout out to Justin Alexander of the Alexandrian blog for catching that. I was not aware of that. Tier 6. Elves are immune to ghoul paralysis. An incredibly specific and odd boon elves get in OD&D and in later basic editions of Dungeons & Dragons is immunity to ghoul paralysis. That's right. All elves, for whatever reason, are specifically immune to being paralyzed just by ghouls. It's an odd bonus, but I believe it makes more sense in the context of OD&D and Chainmail. The fantasy supplement for Chainmail states that ghouls paralyze any normal opponent they hit. OD&D repeats that, but specifies that it excludes elves. My understanding is that it would have excluded elves with just Chainmail too, as I believe Chainmail elves are not considered normal men, but are considered to be in the same fantastical category as heroes, wizards, etc. So, elves are immune to ghoul paralysis in OD&D and the basic editions of D&D because of how elves are categorized in Chainmail. Naturally, I don't think this really makes sense outside of the context of Chainmail. The Angry Villager Rule. A humorous piece of advice for DMs within OD&D is the so-called Angry Villager Rule. I'll just read the whole paragraph word for word so you can get a full picture of what is suggested here. Anyone who has viewed a horror movie is aware of how dangerous angry villagers are. Whenever the referee finds that some player has committed an unforgivable outrage, this rule can be invoked to harass the offender into line. Within the realm of angry villagers are thieves from the Thieves' Quarter, city watches and militia, etc. Also possible is the insertion of some character like Conan to bring matters into line. So yeah, if your players are being proper murder hobos, send Conan after them, or some other legally distinct barbarian. Create food and raise dead are the same level. OD&D has both create food and raise dead as 5th level cleric spells, which are the highest level spells that clerics can learn until the Greyhawk supplement expanded them up to 6th level. Obviously, one seems much more powerful than the other. I've heard it argued that in a wargame context, create food is actually quite powerful. A single cleric with this spell can feed a party of 12 indefinitely. The number of people who can be sustained doubles with each additional cleric level after 8, so, depending on how high level you are, you can end up sustaining a large number of men with nothing but faith forever. In OD&D, the desert is Mars. In the section on wandering monsters by environments, it puts Mars in parentheses after desert and includes in the possible encounters table monsters like red Martians, yellow Martians, Tharks, etc., which are creatures that inhabit Mars in Edgar Rice Burroughs' pulp stories, such as John Carter of Mars. I put in the description a video from the YouTuber The Basic Expert where he talks about this in greater detail. Halflings have no souls. Forget gingers, it turns out halflings don't have souls. I'm kidding, but in the section for raised dead, the spell specifies that it only raises men, elves, and dwarves. It's entirely possible that this is an oversight. Halflings appear to have been a low priority for the authors, as they originally only go up to 4th level, And the text implies incredulity over anyone even wanting to play one. If it wasn't an oversight, then I'm not exactly sure what is the implication. Maybe halflings don't have souls, or maybe their small bodies just can't handle the stress of resurrection. After all, the spell does state that characters with low constitutions cannot be raised. The game doesn't actually limit halfling constitution, but even the toughest halfling is still the size of a literal child. You can build your own castle. Ever want to build your own castle? I never really thought about it previously, but now I do. OD&D has a section on stronghold construction. Gygax really geeks out here as he uses medieval terminology such as portcullis and barbican. I have no idea what a barbican is. A small tower costs 4,500 gold pieces, while a wooden door costs 10 gold pieces. Honestly, I think this is brilliant. For one thing, it's a legitimate gold sink. Players having nothing to spend gold on is a big problem in modern D&D, but in 1974, you could just spend all your gold on a freaking castle. For another thing, it's a base of operations you can build anywhere with enough time. Plus, it's a castle. Who the heck doesn't want a freaking castle? If I were a player, I think I would maybe make a burger joint. I'd, build an actual castle, paint it white, you know, call it White Castle, and sell some medieval burgers. That's probably why I don't play much. Dragons are really common. I believe the current sentiment around dragons in D&D is that they are relatively rare, and encountering one is a huge deal. Interestingly enough, in OD&D, there is usually a 1 in 8 chance of encountering a dragon when traveling in the wilderness. I suspect the world building implications for this are huge. To be fair, though, it's literally in the name of the game. It's funny how both Dungeons and Dragons have become less common in modern Dungeons and Dragons. Reaction rolls. OD&D doesn't give a explicit mechanic for charisma to influence social scenarios, but it does have a generic social mechanic, which is the reaction roll. Reaction rolls are a staple of TSR era D&D, though OD&D actually has two of them. The first provided is specifically for recruiting NPCs, though it could easily be used for other things. The lowest value, 2, results in the players being attacked, while the best value, 12, results in the NPCs being enthusiastically loyal. The second reaction roll is much less granular, with only 3 results of a negative, uncertain, or positive reaction. Later editions like the basic line would use the first reaction roll for social interaction and would modify it by charisma, but I personally think the second reaction roll table in OD&D makes more sense being modified by charisma, as bonuses and penalties up to 2 don't exclude any possible results. But that's just an aside. I do conceptually like reaction rolls as a social mechanic more than modern charisma checks, as they set the stage for social interactions without always determining how they conclude. Werebears are lawful. It turns out werebears are quite the gentlemen. For whatever reason, werebears are listed as being lawful or neutral in alignment, as opposed to werewolves, werebears, and weretigers, who are all neutral or chaotic in alignment. For the life of me, I can't figure out how or why werebears would be lawful. It's an entertaining idea, though. Maybe that's supposed to represent Beorn from The Hobbit. I don't know. Zylarthan, the Magic User. The sample player character provided in the OD&D rules is Zylarthan, the Magic User. With 6 strength, he had, quote, no real chance to become a fighter. His wisdom is higher than his intelligence, but his player chose for him to become a magic user out of preference anyway, which is a point I appreciate them making. Curiously, though, with the rules ability score adjustment I explained in the first video, Zylarthan's hypothetical player could have subtracted 4 points of wisdom to give him 2 extra points of intelligence, allowing him to advance just as fast as a magic user as he would have as a cleric. The most iconic thing about this example character is his name, as Zylarthan is legendary. Interestingly enough, there is an OD&D retroclone named after him called The Seven Voyages of Zylarthan. I'll link it in the description if you're curious. Anti-clerics. Not all clerics in OD&D are squeaky clean good guys. Tucked away in the description for high-level cleric spells is a note that there are, quote, anti-clerics who cast reverse versions of some of these spells. These spells are as follows. Cure light wounds, purified food and water, detect evil, protection from evil, light, bless, cure disease, continual light, cure serious wounds, greater protection from evil, dispel evil, and raise dead. I'm sure you can imagine what these inversions are. Light becomes darkness, cure light wounds becomes cause light wounds, etc. Raise dead actually becomes finger of death, which is an incredibly awesome name for a spell. The text isn't clear if anti-clerics are intended to be a player class or an NPC class. Regardless, the anti-cleric is implied as a sort of death priest warrior mage who wields arms, armor, darkness, and death magic, which is incredibly metal. It says that a regular cleric might reverse raise dead and cast Finger of Death in a life or death situation, but if they misuse it, they're turned into an anti-cleric. It appears that becoming an anti-cleric may have been sort of a fail-state similar to what paladins would go on to have. Tier 7, the Blackmore Supplement. The Blackmore Supplement to OD&D was released in 1975. It has the distinction of being the only official D&D product to have its writing credited just to D&D co-creator Dave Arneson. It features a grab bag of ideas, most of which were not retained in future publications of D&D. Two subclasses it added, though, have passed the test of time. Blackmore was the oldest D&D campaign. In the foreword to the supplement, Gary Gygax claims that Blackmore, the name for the setting Dave Arneson ran his personal campaign in, was the oldest D&D campaign. This is accurate, as Dave Arneson was actually running Dungeons & Dragons styled games before Gary Gygax actually introduced him to them. This is a nod to the fact that Dave Arneson effectively invented the concept of the game, but I believe Gary Gygax had a larger role in actually developing the codified rules of the game. This is a somewhat contentious topic due to elements of D&D history, and I don't pretend to have the conclusive answer on that. That's just my overall impression of things. Monks. The first subclass Blackmore adds to the game is the Monk. Monks are a massive departure from all previous classes, as they gain a ton of features over time. In this sense, they strongly resemble a 5e class. Clerics can choose to be monks if they have at least 15 wisdom, 12 strength, and 15 dexterity. Like the paladin, this is a very unlikely class to qualify for. If you manage to be a monk, you can't wear armor, but you get features like added damage with weapons, the ability to stun opponents with attacks, multiple attacks, thief skills, the ability to perfectly simulate death, self-healing, resistance to psychic attacks, and the ability to outright kill someone with quivering palm. Yes, I think this class is absurd. In its defense, it may have been intended to be counterbalanced by not getting magic items. They can't wear armor and they can't use potions or scrolls. They're also limited in regards to followers. Being stuck with basically only magical rings may mean that in the long run, more featureless classes like fighters equalize with them through magic items. But that's just speculation. Assassins. The second subclass added to the game in this supplement is the Assassin. Assassins have to be neutral, aligned human thieves with at least 12 strength and 12 dexterity, which is a much more reasonable requirement for a specialty class than monks have. They can only wear leather armor, but they can also wear shields. Their skills are always effectively 2 levels behind what they would have if they were just thieves, but they compensate by being masters of disguise and poison. They also have an assassination table, which is somewhat consternating. It appears to give your assassin a percentage chance to eliminate a given NPC with just a roll outside of combat. It seems you could just go on an assassination mission during downtime and just roll percentile dice to see if you succeed or not, and thus if you get paid or not. What happens if you fail? I don't know. While I do like the fact that the assassin subclass has rules to facilitate them actually being assassins during downtime, I feel like these specific rules could really break a game. Plus, that's just not how D&D resolves situations like that. Poisoned weapons give enemies ferocity. Assassins are free to use poison in combat, but this comes with a curious downside. There's a 50% chance each turn that an enemy within 10 feet of you will see that you are using poison and will attack with ferocity, gaining +4 to hit and +4 damage. This seems rather extreme and cartoonish to me. Like when you were trying to kill me normally, it was chill, but now that I see you're trying to kill me with poison, all of a sudden I'm in pure rage mode. Maybe it's a counterbalance to prevent poison from being overpowered, but it just seems like a strange execution. Hit location. A system Blackmore added that did not stand the test of time is hit location. Basically, it strips away the abstract of attack rolls against armor class and damage dice versus hit points by making it so each attack hits a certain part of the body, head, chest, back, arms, legs, and deals individual damage to that part. Damaging multiple body parts accrues overall damage that can end up taking out the opponent, but it appears the quickest path to victory is to attack the head, as the head has 15% of that character's total hit points. So, even an incredibly powerful character with 100 hit points can die if 15 points of damage target their head, While this system seems very cool to me, it also seems quite cumbersome. I think I would perhaps use it for huge monsters with massive hit points, so whittling it down isn't a slog. I think getting a lucky headshot against a giant which would be much more exciting if you knew you only needed a few of those to kill it. The system gets into needless minutia by giving different percentages based on which side of the body you're facing, and even gives individual percentages for using hit location in combat against creatures like snakes and birds. Weapon height adjustment matrix. Another needlessly complex and clunky system introduced in this supplement is the weapon height adjustment matrix. Using the height of the attacker and the defender, you determine how likely you are to automatically hit a deadly area like the head, only hit a wounding area like the legs, or just hit normally with the hit location rules. The length of your weapon can also affect this. Overall, I think there's a clear reason why the system did not make it past this edition. Maybe it would effectively give human fighters a much needed edge over demi-human fighters beyond just reaching higher levels. I don't know. And that would be dwarves and halflings because they're much shorter than humans. It wouldn't affect the human elf power balance. Octopi attack 6 times. A funny detail about the giant octopus introduced in Blackmore is that it attacks 6 times with its tentacles as well as bites. Yes, 6 tentacle attacks despite having 8 tentacles. What are the other 2 tentacles doing while it's attacking you? Who knows? Minotaur Lizard. A humorous addition to the monster list is the Minotaur Lizard, as nothing about it is actually akin to Minotaurs, and it is expressly called out as having feet. It is generally considered to just be a typo of monitor lizard. Sahuagin. Blackmore introduces the iconic aquatic monster called the Sahuagin. Now I have no idea how to pronounce that name. The book gives them a backstory involving a great flood of the earth and conflict between the gods of law, neutrality, and chaos. The book goes into great detail about their appearances, societies, and cultures. I think they're a good example of the fact that this book is of low quality when it comes to actual rules and systems, but a high quality when it comes to creative lore and raw imagination. Manta rays are chaotic clerical philosophers. The bizarre entry for the Ix Ixixchalitl, I have no idea how to say that, monster calls it a race of chaotic clerical philosophers and states that they resemble manta rays. 10% of them are vampire equivalent and are affected by things like crosses. I don't know how well holy water works when you're in the ocean. I'm honestly quite confused by there being chaotic philosopher manta ray vampires in OD&D, but it's in the territory of wonderfully weird. You can be Aquaman in OD&D. A funny magic item provided in the supplement is the iconic Trident of Fish Control. A clear nod to DC's Aquaman, it does what's on the tin. Temple of the Frog. Blackmore introduces the first official published adventure location of sorts within it. The Temple of the Frog is given as an adventure location with a detailed history, dungeon complex, and faction guide. It's actually quite cool. It features things like crazy swamp priests who've developed giant murder frogs because they think frogs are evolutionarily superior to humans or have the potential to be. I'm not sure how usable or easily usable what's in the book actually is, but it's incredibly imaginative nonetheless. Stephen the Rock. The central antagonist of the Temple of the Frog is an individual named Stephen the Rock. He's actually a time traveling alien of sorts who uses advanced technology that is indistinguishable from magic. He's an example of how D&D at this time was much more fluid when it came to genres like medieval fantasy and sci-fi than it currently is. Don't kill sages. Blackmore gives surprisingly in-depth rules for NPC sages, including their loyalty, their area of expertise, and how likely they are to have answers to questions about those fields. Comically, anyone who attacks a sage is changed to a chaotic alignment and cursed by the sage. In fact, the remove curse spell does not even work against this special sage curse, but a quest from a cleric might. I have to assume this is the result of an annoyed DM punishing a player for killing his favorite exposition deliverer. Mummies have leprosy. The final section of the book is on diseases and how likely you are to contract them in places like swamps. If you ever wanted to die on the chamber pot in D&D from dysentery, congrats, there's rules for it. Also, mummies apparently can give you leprosy, which has interesting implications.